Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Pesnichek with the Dynamic Self Astrology, and I'm here for a one-off today. As some of us know, we are on the back end of the much anticipated 2024 presidential election. And for many of us, we're just figuring out where to go from here because the results were not what we wanted. And even though I used astrology to predict that the outcome that did happen would happen. And that actually gave me a little bit more time to deal with the possibility of that because I was in the astrology so much there's still a lot to deal with. Even though I had a head start to some degree in my grieving and dealing with the reality of that situation. That's what these times are about. It's going to be one side or the other. So anyways, as I record this, it's November 9th, 2024. And many people have asked me how I came to the conclusions that I did with looking at the elections. And I did put up a pretty dense report of my findings. It's about 45 pages long, so it's a lot of heavy astrology in it. So I thought I would just throw out this really quick explanation. I compiled a couple of slides for a podcast that I was just on with Christina with Radiant Astrology. Please check that out. We had a really great conversation and got to some of this material, but not all of it. So, and while there's not a ton of it, I also just wanted to create some space where I could present it all together. So that's what I'm doing here right now. So let's get started. I'm going to bring up the presentation. Okay. So I think you can see that now. It's being shared. So this was, to some degree, kind of the baseline of what I was looking at in my research. And for some reason, my mouse is not working with the way that I have the settings up right now. So we're just going to have to look at this. But I have circled the things that I'm most interested in pointing out. First, turning to the bottom of the page where we have a big purple line and a big blue line. And this is Neptune semisquare Poseidon and Poseidon, Neptune semisquare Poseidon and Poseidon sesquisquare Aries point. So what this illustrates is that we're in a time where our beliefs, our spiritual orientation are really at the forefront. And there's a lot of ways that we can spin this. We also have Neptune in Pisces, which is something that I've been really interested in. And I'm in the middle of writing an article about Neptune in Pisces, as well as this alignment with both Poseidon and Aries point. So Poseidon is the higher octave to some degree of Neptune. It's Neptune without the dissolving. It's a higher mind, higher thought, higher beliefs. If you could, in some ways, I almost imagine it as just the higher self of all of us. And we can see that individually. We can also see that collectively, where our higher selves bringing us. And that's something where it might look different to everybody, but that's something also that people are largely working to align themselves with or figuring out what those beliefs really are. And that's a much bigger thing as well. The Neptune Poseidon together, especially with the Aries point, can also signify flooding at a large scale, which we've definitely seen all over the world while this alignment has taken place. And here we have Poseidon to the Aries point. I don't know that the dates that I have on here are correct because the timeline was actually much longer. So the Poseidon Aries point was longer than what I'm showing on here, but the Neptune to Poseidon began May 25th, 2024. So that's that. So undercurrents to the environment that we're working in. And then what's really important with this is that the orange bars above the purple and blue our Aries point equals Uranus and Volcanus. And what this signifies is that the Aries point is falling in the midpoint of Uranus and Volcanus. And for those of you who aren't astrologers, what that means is they're all just working together. And what this combination points towards, it's a time of heightened, time of instability, of uncertainty, of also of changes with technology, which we're also seeing, which aligns with the movement of Pluto into Aquarius as well. So a lot of iteration of just life is almost in this, is getting shaken up very vigorously. And it's stressful, but it's also exciting because we know that we're on the precipice of something big. When we look at the outline of the orange boxes, there's 3 of them. We see that looking the one on the furthest left, and I circled Mars conjunct Uranus, and that took place around July 13th. My screen is covering it up right now. But that's the Mars activity aligning with this Uranus Volcanus, which the Mars interacting directly with this alignment is a big deal. And that's when we saw the attempted assassination of Trump, the first one, as well as the handover of Democratic ticket from Biden to Harris. And then when we move into the actual election time, right now and during the election, the real highlight was the Mars opposite Pluto, which plays in with the Uranus Volcanus Aries point in that it's a lot of tension and pressure, and there's chaos and there's pressure and there's power plays, and that is part of the chaos that's happening. There's also a lot of revolutionary spirit within the Uranus Volcanus as well, and also when you throw in the Mars. Now, in mid to late November, we're going to have Mars conjunct Volcanus, which is going to activate, similar to how it did in July, this combination. And while I have not been working with Uranian astrology on this fine level, I'm not quite sure. I'm really curious to see if anything plays out at that time. And maybe we just see more revolutionary spirit and more things with Trump now being the president-elect, just being shaken up and being done in a very unorthodox way. Or we could also see some protests. We could see a whole sorts of different things. Uranus is a very multidimensional archetype, and I think that a lot of what I was pointing to in my report that I saw as being very volatile. While it felt very volatile to many people, I think overall it was overturning the status quo and not wanting the status quo to be at the center of our political world anymore. And so we saw the Democrats, with much more of a status quo perspective, as well as Kamala Harris, whose natal chart is much more status quo than Trump's. So she didn't fit into this zeitgeist of revolution the same way that Trump did. So that's a large way of how I'm seeing that. And we see that Mars conjunct Volcanus happening not only from November 15th to November 27th, but also to the middle of end and to end of December, from December 17th to December 27th. And then we have one more pass of that in April 23rd to April 27th, where we also have that Mars opposite Pluto again. And what this is illustrating is the Mars retrograde that is coming up, that will begin in the beginning of Leo and retrograde back to, I believe it's about 17 degrees of Cancer or something like that. So that's what we're seeing. And we also, during that same time, which is really interesting, have that same alignment of Aries point equals Uranus Volcanus, which I was speaking to. So when I was doing my work, this was something that I kept as just this background zeitgeist of what was happening in ether. And we really saw that play out in July, I think, as well as earlier than that when we were realizing that Biden might not be in good enough shape. His he might be too aged to run for president for one more term. And here we go. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to point out here is how really loosely how I structured looking deeper into what is this site theme that we have going on. And I looked at a bunch of mundane timing charts, including the Aries ingress chart. I looked at several of the new moon charts, specifically the one right before the election. I looked at the one here, which is the Scorpio new moon. And yeah, and that's the one right before the election. I also looked at the Libra solar eclipse, because that is also a really strong predictive tool. And there were a lot of themes that came out of these, mostly that we kept finding. If you look at the chart on the left, the traditional chart, that the ascendant was consistently, not always, but consistently enough in the middle late degrees of Scorpio, which consistently put Uranus on the descendant, or basically angular, and then Poseidon also angular. And if you remember back to the slide that we just looked at, this is reiterating the Poseidon. What are your beliefs? What do you hold on to? What is your higher self saying? And Uranus shaking things up and maybe driving us more into our having to find some sort of belief system for ourselves. And while that's a whole nother subject on its own, I really want to keep the whole Poseidon belief thing that is definitely embedded, I think, in politics, specifically American politics, the way that it plays out, but having some sort of a godhead to some degree. But it is interesting that it was consistently Poseidon that was showing up in juxtaposition to Uranus. So, all right. And then you see here on the right, so this is the 360-degree Uranian dial. And this is showing um, the Uranus, Vulcanus. So to the left here, this is Vulcanus. To the right over here is Uranus. And then you can see Mars here. It's not close enough to consider to be part of this alignment yet, but you can see how it's getting close and how this is going to align in the dates that I showed you before. And because of its retrograde, it's going to move back and forth through here. And you can even see the signs in this 360-degree dial. So that is that. Okay, and then this is the Aries ingress chart. So this is just reiterating the same thing that I was telling you before with the Scorpio ascendant, Uranus on the descendant. And this is the Aries ingress, which these timing charts tend to do what I call, like, they nest into one another. And I think the Aries ingress chart, from my perspective, as far as what I can tell so far in the work that I've done, tends to be the biggest nest. And then the solar eclipse charts nest into that. And then the new moon charts nest into that. And that's how I looked at it, similar to how when you do natal astrology, everything comes back to the natal chart, and you have to constantly reference back to the natal chart and see what the natal promises. The Aries chart really is like the natal promise for that year. It's a very important predictive chart. And what we see here is we have Poseidon again on the ascendant. We have Uranus on the descendant, and we have Jupiter here, which is also towards the beginning of the year. We had the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, which kind of, I feel like, jump started us into the Uranian energy of this year, and that showing up and highlighted in this Aries ingress chart, which is saying that this energy is very important for this year. And then the Mars down here. So we also have this combination of Mars, Uranus, and any planets that are on the angles are very important And for the purpose of so much data, I focused on other stuff, but I really put a heavy emphasis on what showed up on the angles in these charts because it was so fascinating. And here we have the Mars Uranus again, that there's the tendency for forceful revolution. And when I was looking at this, I was really convinced that this election could have some level of violence to it. We're not done yet, and I hope that I was wrong, but yeah, it definitely, I think more of what it may have been is the revolutionary spirit in the people to change the government from what it saw as the status quo, whether you agree with that or not, as well as the anxiety and the nervousness and the not knowing what's going to happen, and that continues. That sentiment definitely continues as we move forward as well, is what's gonna happen with this new administration. It's a little bit of a curveball administration by many means, which can mean, all sorts of stuff. And then also when we turn to the dial, this is the 90-degree dial, looking at the moon, which is the people, and we see Vulcanus very close to this moon, which reinstates that the people, and also aligned with Uranus and Mercury, that the people are really anxious about the news. They're anxious and very involved about the volatile news that it is just throwing curveball after curveball at them. And like I said, this is from the Aries ingress chart, which began in March 19th, 2024, and will last until that time in 2025 when the sun ingresses into Aries again. And then we also have this Hades here, which is very prominent, which in some ways can represent an aged leader, which we also have the sun on a point here. We have the aged leader, we have the leader who has a criminal record, who people aren't quite sure about, as well as maybe just people feeling like the government in general is somewhat criminal. There's a lot going on in this chart. We also very interestingly have Venus aligned with Neptune, which if we're looking at this from as Venus representing a female, it's a female who is disappointed within the larger zeitgeist, or a woman who can't get her voice heard enough, who can't break through the fog and the noise and the amplification of all of the chaos in the news that's happening, which I think we definitely saw some of that with Kamala and her campaign, although I think it was actually run quite well, but she had a lot to run up against. And this is one of the first places that we see an indication of that. And speaking of Kamala, so I spoke to how I looked at the larger picture thing. And I don't think I included any of the charts of the United States, but I also looked at the Sibley chart, looking at their founding chart as a foundation, like how I would use like an Aries ingress chart or a natal chart, and then looked at the solar return and the lunar returns. For Kamala, when I looked at her solar return, I was really struck by how difficult of a fight this is going to be for her. If you're familiar, we have her natal chart here on the left. And just looking at that, just to get an idea of the type of person that Kamala Harris is, she's a strong leader. She has Saturn conjunct her MC, which states that kind of the buck stops with her, and she's not afraid to stand up for herself. And she's going to put in the time, the effort, the work, the strategy to get where she needs to go. And we see this kind of emphasized again in the fact that we have the TNP and Mitos conjunct the moon, and she has a full moon chart in her, a full moon in her natal chart, which reinstates just the focus that she has and the determination and the resolve. And also in some ways, maybe the potential of getting stuck and not having the means to connect emotionally with those who she's trying to emotionally connect with. She may seem more like a leader. And in many ways, in along the lines of what we're talking about, more like the status quo. And in different time, she could really thrive. But with the overall cultural environment that's so electrified and anti-status quo, this is a tough road for her to walk on. I will say that I looked at her stuff on the dial, and I included this in my report as well. And she does have some revolutionary elements to her chart. And we can see some of that even here to some degree, but it is nothing compared to what Trump's natal promise is. And we'll get to that. And so, in that sense, she was on an uphill battle, which she's very well suited for, which I think is part of why she thrived so well. But the environment wasn't conducive in many ways to who she is. And not to say that he wouldn't have done amazing as a president. Much of me doesn't think that she's going anywhere. I could definitely see her run again. But just that she was wrong person at the right time or something like that. So getting into her solar return, we see the solar return ascendant is in her sixth house of hard work, labor, not getting much recognition for the work that you put in, it's not a very visual place. In fact, it's one of the least visual places in the chart. And the other part is that the ruler of that ascendant, which is also very important, is in her natal 12th house, which reiterates that she's not able to get what she's really trying to say. People aren't able to receive it. And it's not a great placement. She already has natally, she has the ruler of her 10th house in her 12th house. And we see that reiterated in the natal chart as well, with the ruler of the 10th house of career in the 12th house. So she's used to that, but she really needed to move out of that realm of being invisible or being, which is so much of the way that her vice presidency was. We didn't see or hear much from her. And I think that really worked against her. And I think that we're seeing that reflected in the solar return chart, is that as well as something that's in her natal chart, which is sometimes it's hard for her just to be seen and to really shine in the way that she needs to in order to obtain the goals that she wants to. Now, this isn't saying that it's not possible. I'm just saying that this was a really tough year for her to try to do that. And maybe that's why she was doing it this year. We also have Admetos and Saturn angular in this chart, which is re-emphasizing the hard work, the putting everything she has into it, the stamina, as well as possibly not being as well received or seen, and as far as connection goes, and being seen more as the leader and the status quo. And I keep coming back to that because that's been something that's really been prevalent in the media. I will say that one thing that she had going for her in this chart is that she has Venus on her ascendant, which on its own is just really nice. And it's the L11 in the solar return chart, which emphasizes that she's really connecting with the masses right now. And she is likely being well received, which she was. But we also see that this Venus is in a pretty close opposition to that Admetos, which is, while it's a great placement, there's a hindrance to it. All right. And I wanted to keep this quick, and I'm trying. Anyway, so I will say that as I was going through my work, there were many times when I was wondering, am I wrong? Am I wrong pointing to Trump as being the front runner? And because there is a lot of positive astrological data behind Kamala Harris at this time. And you can see here, even though this is Cancer up here, this is the Aries point. The Aries point is the 0 degrees of all the cardinal signs, which Cancer is one of them. And this is for her solar return as well. And we see that she's tied into this Uranus Volcanus energy that is happening globally. And her moon is here, which is why I wanted to, which is really the only reason why this makes this personal. So she's like a woman in a role of leadership amongst in a world that's very chaotic, basically, which I think really represents what would what's been happening. And also, yeah, just it's an unstable environment. And for her natal chart, she actually, while she can work with chaos and she does quite well with it, she doesn't thrive in it the same way that Trump does. And when we get to his chart, you'll see why. This is Kamala Harris's timing layers. And I'll just really quickly point out that we have Saturn semi-square the moon and Saturn sesqui-square the sun. And this is tough. It doesn't, it, it creates more, you can see that she's really working hard at this time, at the time of the election. And yeah, I mean, that whenever you have Saturn interacting with with either, in this case, she has both, with her luminaries, you're in for kind of a rough ride. And then we also, more positively, she does have Uranus conjunct Jupiter, which is something I was like, that's really good. And Jupiter is the ruler of her 10th house of careers. So that's quite good. But in the midst of these other aspects happening in corroboration with the challenges of her solar return chart and the challenges of her natal chart in the context of the greater zeitgeist, I was like, is that enough? Is it enough? And that's what I kept coming back to. And I circled down here that for her solar arcs, we have solar arc Chronos and Neptune equals natal MC. If we just would have had solar arc Chronos, that would have been great, because Chronos is leadership, it's high esteem, it's what you want to have highlighted in the chart of somebody who's going to become president. And especially in alignment with the MC. But the problem is that Neptune's there. So that it's indicating that there's something preventing her from getting to her accomplishment of being president, basically. And then this is a midpoint analysis that I did for election day, looking at the solar arc direction, secondary progressions, and the transits. This is using midpoints. So if you're not sure what you're looking at, that's what this is. And I'm not going to go through all of these in any way, but you can see I highlighted here the challenging combinations. And there's quite a few. But the thing is, as you can see, and as I stated before, there's also a lot of really great stuff, which made me wonder, if she doesn't win this time, if she's going to move forward and still continue to do great work in the world. And if this time of running for president is setting her up for something much greater, potentially another run at the White House and winning then. I haven't looked at the timing for that at all. I have no idea what that looks like for her, but definitely making a huge impact for women and women of color. And just, I think that we still don't fully have the complete picture of the impact that she's made, even though, from my perspective, there were likely a lot of votes that she lost because she's a woman of color, specifically, whether people said it or not. She was the Uranus Volcanus on the Aries point as well, in making these huge changes and taking a chance in order to work to change the status quo of only white men run for office, and specifically to men. So no, she didn't win, but I really believe that we will see waves of progress from her running. And I don't know if it's going to be personally what she does or it's just the impacts that she makes on society as a whole. And I look forward to seeing what that points towards. So when I was looking at all of this, I really walked away with a feeling of, no, she's probably not going to win, but she's really made a difference. So, okay. So switching gears here, we have Donald Trump's natal chart on the left. And man, his natal chart is bonkers on its own when you're only looking at the traditional planets and the outer planets. But then you throw in the trans-Neptunian planets, which are the Uranian astrology planets, and it just keeps going. It doesn't stop. So in Trump's chart, natally, as many of us are familiar with, he has this Mars conjunct his ascendant. And it's just he walks in a room throwing punches, and that's just the person that he is. And many people I've heard, especially after the election, described him as a man's man. And that is very much Mars on the ascendant. And what's also interesting about this is that this Mars is both L4 and L9. And L4 represents the family. And Trump carries his family name very proudly. He also works very closely with his family. His family is like part of his governmental cabinet in many ways, as far as I understand, as far him running the government and just in his business operations in general. So they're very central and they come to him. They are in his world. And then the L9 is the courts, it's the legal system. And as we know, Trump constantly has different court cases and all this legal stuff happening at any moment in time. That's very much just who Trump is. And he probably, in some way, is a legal expert on his own because he really seems to know how to maneuver the legal system for sure. But I think that is really interesting. And then up here, we see Kronos, which I mentioned earlier, is conjunct his MC. And Kronos represents, as I stated before, leadership, being like the head honcho, basically, and of government of the highest standing or leadership of the highest standing and having clout. So there's this thing and this element embedded into Trump where he is just revered as a leader. And it's not a buck stops here, the buck stops here leader. It's just no need for a buck. I'm just in charge and it doesn't matter. Just you have to listen to me. And in addition, we have Uranus, North Node, Volcanus, and his sun all in his 10th house, which is a fiery, punching pack of planets and the node. And I mean, that he has seems to be a person with just a lot of fire, a lot of energy. And this also gives him an element of unpredictability, as we already know. So, this on its own signifies that Trump is somebody who i- i- is very tied into the unpredictable. He is the unpredictable. He's the firecracker. He's the dynamite. And he likes to do that. He likes to be the bull in the china shop who comes in and just destroys the place. He's fine with that. A lot more to say about that chart, but moving over here. And then we also, one interesting thing about Trump is he has this really tight moon Volcanus connection. And he's also a full moon baby, but instead of having Enmitos there, he has Volcanus, which can be emotional volatility, emotional just sensitivity and reaction. And we see that with him over and over again. I think in a lot of ways, that's something that drives him is the need to deal with this volatility in his emotional self. And this is how he does it. So there's that too. Okay. So looking at his solar return, which is over here on the right, we see a reiteration of Kronos on the angle on the ascendant here. So leadership is very strongly highlighted this year. In addition, his ascendant falls in his natal 11th house of connecting with groups and working towards goals into the future, having a vision into the future. And the ruler of his ascendant falls in his natal first house, which is really great. That's what you want in a year that you're running for president. You want to have full agency over your year. And if it's in a place like it was with Kamala's in like the 6th or the 12th, then you don't have control. You're just out there and you do have some control, but it's limited. Where in the first house, you have all hands on your gears and you are the one fully running the machinery of your year. And that's what you want in that sort of situation. We also find the ruler of the 10th house of career falls in his natal 10th house of career, which is brilliant. That's what you want. This is also, so that's really good. And Uranus is conjunct his MC basically throughout the entire year by proxy of his solar return, even though he'll definitely feel that more intensely during the actual transits, which we've seen. I will say that he has challenges in this chart for sure, which a lot of astrologers picked up on. He has Saturn and Neptune conjunct his MC, which isn't necessarily what you would want. That could definitely indicate him having situations where he's contemplating the possibility of dying, is very much what Saturn and Neptune straddling the angle can represent. So, and just feeling some level of loss as well. So, it definitely makes sense to me that that could definitely be something to lean on pretty heavily. The other piece here that I think is important is that we have his solar return L1 in opposition to his solar return L8 and L9 and also his L7, but I think the L8 and L9 were a little bit more interesting to me because I don't think we're gonna find out what's going on in his relationships. But this indicates that he's having a lot of tension with money, with debt, with investments, as well as with legal issues. So that's where we see that. Okay, so here I put two dials on here looking at his solar return on the dial. Both of these are 90-degree dials. The first one here on the left is looking at his ascendant, which, as we saw on the chart, is very close to that Chronos, which you look at that and you're like, okay, it's a year where he personally is a leader. And while you can't take that as the only significator, it does corroborate once you start looking at some other layers as well. And then we have Epsilon MC, which shows that he is connecting with many people and having successful connections. And and then we also have the Uranus, Jupiter with the Admetos. And so I think that the Jupiter Uranus really optimal, any chaos that's thrown his way has this optimal turn of events to it, even if there may be hardship and mitos involved in it. And then looking over here at I think we're looking at this MC, Sun MC, midpoint. Sun MC is leadership. I am the leader. I have success. And we also see Mercury and Venus here, indicating that he is able to connect through his words with people, through his success, and as he reaches for that success. And then Mars Uranus is also, or Mars Volcanus is also tied in. Uranus is as well. It's definitely maybe a little far, but close enough for sure, I think, to tie in. So we also have the excitement and the drive to do whatever needs to be done. A huge resource of energy, a lot of activity this year for Trump, which you would expect. So when we look at his timing layers, we have Uranus square Mars, and that's October 5th to November 3rd. Apollon moon, Uranus, Mercury, Uranus conjunct MC, Jupiter trine Jupiter, which is not a traditional Uranian aspect because it's not a hard aspect, but one that I thought I would mention. And then at the time, on the day of election day or the inauguration, he has Chronos semi square to the sun. So that's a very small grained alignment. But when I saw this, so Chronos sun is the leader of High, the success through leadership, through basically when I think of that combination, I think of the crown being put on somebody's head. And it is a pretty small grained aspect, but the fact that it was happening on the day of inauguration, I was like, how does that not corroborate? Clearly, there's a lot of other stuff going on as well, which I'm not going to get so far into, but overall, mostly very positive stuff. So I guess what I'll say here is that we see this just flush of potentially positive, if not positive, exciting and revolutionary energy in his timing. And where when we looked at Kamala Harris's, it was a little bit more subdued. And while there was like one nice thing, it was largely dampered by a lot more heavier obstructions to the path that she was trying to reach. And then this is the Donald Trump midpoint analysis for election day, the same method that I used for Kamala Harris's earlier. But the green this time are the favorable combinations. As you can see, there's a lot of them. And like I said, I had moments where I wasn't quite sure if what I was seeing as being the result was the result. But because there are some pretty negative stuff, but the overwhelming census was that things are positive for him this day. So what does this mean now that we have this bull in a china shop, change maker president bringing in an administration that is going to be different? It's going to be different. And I guess what I've learned and what gave me solace as I came to the realization that it was very likely that Trump would win this election is that it's the zeitgeist that we're in, and we don't have to agree. And I wish that there was another way to navigate the change that we're currently in and that we have in front of us. But he's going to be the demolition crew that comes in and takes out the foundation to some degree. And I don't know exactly what that means, but apparently that's what is needed at this time. And I like to think about my own life when there's been lots of change and chaos and that sort of thing that I haven't felt comfortable with in the moment. And I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, thank goodness that happened, because we wouldn't be where we are now. So I suspect that there's a lot of things, both within our government as well as within our culture at large, that is stuck and could do better. And I really urge each and every one of us to just every day as we go through this next 4 years, just show up as the best part of yourself as you can, because that's what the change that is happening really needs. And many of the upcoming the shifts that are happening in 2025 specifically, as well as into 2026, but we have Pluto into Aquarius, which actually is happening with its final ingress November 19th, 2024. And we've been in the midst of the US Pluto return, which is a huge transit. Many of us, if you've worked with an astrologer before, you may have heard of the Pluto square, which happens in like the early 40s. And that's a tough transit. You're basically unearthing all of the bits that are uncomfortable that you pushed down. And now Pluto's saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. In fact, we're going to we're just going to unearth all that, and we're going to sit with it, and we're going to deal with it. And it's can be quite a messy process, and we've definitely been doing that to some degree over the past couple years. And when we take the precessed Pluto into account, Pluto's actually at 1 degrees Aquarius 1 minute, and it can be argued that we are still in the middle of this Pluto return. And if you ask me, it still feels like it. Just that we were still unearthing a lot of the nastier parts of our country and our nation, and maybe the ways that it was founded that might not, and as well as some of the ghosts in our closet that we need to take seriously and pull out and deal with, even if it's really uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of the Uranus activity that I identified in all of this timing and really believe is the core archetype of this time that we're in, it's shaking things up in order to get deeper into the Pluto stuff as well. I really see the two working together. And the Uranus shaking up and maybe causing earthquakes, uh, metaphorically, in order to move the ghosts and the hidden stuff up to the surface more so that we have to deal with it. And that's how we're going to grow. It's hard. It's hard. It's hard. It sounds so cliche to put a positive spin on it when you're in the middle of it. But I really think that we're in the middle of that. And we're going to look back, I think, after this Pluto and Aquarius and over the next 20 years and really just have a better 2020 vision of what we're in right now. The other thing coming up is a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is taking place on the Aries point. And the conjunction itself is happening February 20th, 2026. But we're going to have Saturn and Neptune moving back and forth across the Aries point. Saturn and Neptune together are a tricky pair. They've both been in dreamy Pisces and compassionate Pisces and maybe a little complacent Pisces to some degree. For Neptune for quite a while, Saturn for the past year and a half or so. And this move into Aries, first of all, is a huge shift just in temperament of signs. Aries is much more aggressive. It's okay. It's a very new beginning. But where the planets are meeting at 0 degrees Aries, that's the Aries point. That is the basically, I think of it as the air that we're all breathing, the memo that we all got that we didn't realize that we got, or just like the air coming through the ventilation systems. And very subtle, but it's also very strong because we're universally experiencing it. And I wonder if there's going to be a big shift in this next year or so. And spiritually, this is a paper that I've been working on, is looking at Neptune's time in Pisces and overlapping with this interaction that it's had with Poseidon, and how we've been digging into ancient shamanic activity, yoga, plant medicine, dream work, so many things that I can't even think of right now. But there's been this huge shift towards that, which we've seen before, but not to this degree and not in the same way. But I wonder if there's going to be some big shift in that part of our culture around that time, as well as just dissolving the structures that we stand upon, dissolving the status quo that I kept talking about. Uranus is shaking it up and throwing grenades at it, and Neptune's, don't worry, I'll just dissolve it. Much easier. A little bit longer process, but much more thorough. Nothing will be detected afterwards. So there's a little bit of this going on, and I'm not quite sure exactly how that will be manifesting, but it is a big change. And lastly, we have Uranus into Gemini. Its initial ingress will take place July 7th, 2025. The final ingress will be November 7th, 2025. And Uranus into Gemini is huge. We've had Uranus in Taurus, which is very similar, I think, and very reminiscent of what we've been experiencing over the past since Uranus has been in Taurus for the past 7 years or so. It's shaking up the things that are familiar and the things that are stuck, the things that feel comfortable. But Uranus into Gemini is just going to be a fast line for technological advancement, especially because it's going to be in a trine to Pluto and Aquarius. And it's also going to be in a sextile to Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which can also, in its own way, have its own advancement to it. And I won't get into all of that, but this is a huge shift. The U.S. Uranus is at 8 degrees Gemini, 55 minutes. So in the next couple years, we're going to have the U.S. Uranus return. And then we're going to have the U.S., it's going to hit the U.S. descendant, and then it's going to hit the U.S. Mars. And what historically has happened when Uranus is in Gemini for the United States is that the United States has become involved in some sort of a war. It was the hallmark of the Civil War. And then also, I can't remember which world war it was off the top of my head, but basically we get pulled into wars that we were not planning on getting involved in overseas. The disruption that we're feeling now, it's not the end of it. We've been feeling it for a while. And then we also have Jupiter into Cancer, which will be very positive for the United States. I think that's going to be the balm on our nervous systems will be Jupiter moving into Cancer in June 9th, 2025. So a lot of shifts coming in 2025. We don't normally have this many outer planets all shifting at the same time. And right now we have Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus all shifting. It's very abnormal for that to happen. And Saturn at the same time. So that's what we're working towards, and we don't know what that means. And I guess my advice with all of this is just, you know, stay true to yourself and find your excitement, find your light. Like I said, I think when I was speaking with Christina yesterday with Radiant Astrology, is hold your light. We're at this crossroads where so much is changing, and we're going to be at crossroad after crossroad, just making these new decisions and how to move forward and what to do. And most of what we're up against we're not going to have any precedents for it before. A lot of it we could be doing to some degree for the first time, especially when it comes to all of this technology, as well as climate change. Climate change is also a huge player in all of this and can also be part of the Neptune, Poseidon with the Uranus Volcanus archetype is chaos due to flooding and water. And so we're going to start seeing more of that likely as we know. And how do we deal with that? This is something that's been on our plates for a long time. And we may really have to make some real changes. And humans don't like change, but that's what we're here to do. Stay grounded in yourself. Keep people around you who support you, and support one another. This is not a time to divide. It is not a time to add more unnecessary chaos or friction to your plate or anybody else's plate. The world really needs each and every one of us to show up in the best way that we possibly can. And with the way that this election went and the way that the astrology looks, it's really that simple and that hard. So I really thank you for joining me on this little expedition through my research. I hope it was helpful. I guess the most helpful part for me is just to know or feel within myself, and I guess also know that there is a much bigger picture and we're all here for it. And it's beautiful. And I think on some level, even though it's hard at times, that we're we're part of a pretty important human experiment here. And I think on some level, we all know that we're grateful for being here at this time. So thank you for showing up. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, do all the stuff. I have monthly newsletters. I have a podcast with Sarah Beckner called Broadcast Astrology. We're coming out with a new podcast in a week or so on Uranus, which is very appropriate. We randomly planned that and seemed like a good idea. So stay tuned. A lot more to cover. Lots of love to all of you. Take care. Mwah.